This event is co-hosted by the Clayman Institute for Gender Research and its Center for the Advancement of Women's Leadership, also the Stanford School of Engineering, and is co-sponsored by Glassdoor. Thank you to all the sponsors for today. We all believe in bringing together the best thinking from industry and from academia, which includes social sciences and engineering and education, all the perspectives that can help us work on these problems. We hope today that we can work to move the needle on pay equality. Today's event is intended to stimulate discussion and collaboration. I don't think we'll solve it, but we hope to make progress. These issues around pay equality are very complex, and this is a long problem, a long process. We're going to ask some hard questions today and discuss some new ideas. We believe the discussion will be part of a pathway forward, hopefully towards creating sustainable change and real progress. Within Stanford, we also want to help our graduating seniors and our graduate students have the best chance of thriving when they begin their careers outside of Stanford. In the School of Engineering, we also have our own problems with culture, and we're very interested in this chance to learn from industry. We have complementary and very similar and overlapping challenges. I believe that your experiences and solutions can be solutions for us too. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you're doing in industry to see if we can apply those same methods and practices within the school. So now I'd like to turn things over to Lori McKenzie. She's the Executive Director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research and the Center for the Advancement of Women's Leadership at Stanford University, and she will introduce the speakers and lead the discussion.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Today's conversation really is a chance for us to move the needle, bringing together the best ideas from academia and the best thinkers from industry. So I'd like to introduce the panelists today. To our far end of the table, we have Shelley Carell, Professor of Sociology and, by courtesy, Organizational Behavior, and the Barbara D. Finberg Director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research. We have Blake Irving, the CEO of GoDaddy, Sherry Shepard, the Burton J. and Dee Dee McMurtry, University Fellow in Undergraduate Education and Professor of Mechanical Engineering. We have Cindy Robbins, who's the Executive Vice President at Salesforce for Global Employee Success. And last, Robert Homan, who is the co-founder and CEO of Glassdoor.
I think we ought to get fancier titles to start with. I think you should be like the, we need some names in front of our titles.
Exactly.
Super long.
I could have said Chief Executive Officer. That would have stretched it just a little
I was
bit.
thinking, more like
Title equity.
the Bill Gates CEO of, I don't know. All right, anyway, I'm just talking out loud.
Okay.
Lightning
Thank
out.
you. And it's my job to control the conversation.
Let's go.
Here we go.
Let's do it.
All right. So as we said, pay equity is a challenging question. Women have been out-earning men in undergraduate degrees for over 30 years, and yet the pay gap has not closed, and in the past 10 years, it really goes up a penny, down a penny. Why is that? So we're going to start the conversation framing it with a little bit of research. We're going to start with Shelley Carell. And Shelley, I'd like you to really talk about what is the gender wage gap, and is it a myth or is it a reality?
Yeah, thanks. I thought it would be good to sort of start off with just setting a definition that I think a lot of people probably know. The gender wage gap is the ratio of women's earnings to men's, and this is usually expressed in annual earnings for men and women who work year-round full-time. And that currently is at 79.6%. So women are earning about 80% of what men are. There are lots of factors that contribute to that gap, and one of the biggest factors is the segregation of men and women into different kinds of jobs. So women tend to be found in jobs with lots of other women, and those jobs also happen to pay less. And so that's one of the big factors that contributes to that. And I point that factor out because when some people hear that, they begin to think that the gender wage gap is sort of a myth. It's not really coming about for any reasons that we can act upon. It's simply the result of women's choices, that women choose jobs that pay less, and that if women would choose different jobs, the gender wage gap would go away. But I think it's really important for us who, wanting to work on pay equity to understand that interpretation of the data assumes that women can just choose any jobs they want to, okay? okay, when we have a lot of social science evidence that suggests that our stereotypes about gender constrain women's career choices in all kinds of ways. So rather than seeing that as a factor that explains the wage gap, to me, these factors are really sites where we can intervene. If we want to bring about pay equity, what can we do right there to affect how people's careers unfold and the way those career paths shape their earnings?
And what's really interesting about what you're saying about the different career paths is typically we don't have data at the title or job level. And what's really interesting about the latest Glassdoor analysis is that we can start to unpack how that works within a company and by title. So I don't know, Robert, if you want to share some of your latest findings.
So I think, so Glassdoor collects anonymous information from people on what they make, what it's like to work at their companies. That's what we do. We see about 35 million people a month for the service. So we have a very large data set of salaries that are reported. We see about women make about 74 cents to the dollar for men, roughly speaking. So in the range of the 79 cents that government is reporting. I think what's limiting about that statistic and data is it frankly doesn't resonate very well with many leaders and executives. Like I know as a CEO, I certainly sat back and said, I don't pay anyone 74 cents on the dollar. I certainly never set out to pay anyone 74 cents on the dollar. It just doesn't resonate, doesn't make sense. And so we wanted to understand this much better, and we had the data to be able to do it. So we call that the unadjusted pay gap. But we're able to take the data and adjust it for job title, location, experience, length of time in role, sort of all the things that you could argue justifiably should drive pay. So a couple things fall out of that. One, there's 6% left over. So there is bias. It's not 20-some%, and which is, again, I think doesn't resonate with a lot of leaders, but it's about 6% when you control for all, and it's statistically significant, and this is a published, peer-reviewed data set, and it's real. And that's small enough, too, that, like, that's believable that, like, that's going on in our organizations kind of right under our noses, and it ought to be fixed. We call this idea that women end up in these different roles that pay less, we call it career sorting, or that's what the economists call it. And it does explain about half of it. It certainly doesn't justify it, but it at least explains why they end up, why the pay is what it is. But the other part that is, there is something that we don't fully understand yet, which has to do with promotions and career trajectory, which explains sort of the other, another 25% of the pay gap. And so anyway, that's what we see. The adjusted is about 6%, unadjusted is about 25%. And then we begin to see interesting things because we can look at it by job title. So are there any engineers in the room, software engineers? Okay, good. So you'll understand what I mean, what I'm talking about when I give you these titles. Okay, computer programmer is a job title that's not really used. I actually didn't even realize it was used at all anymore, but it is. And computer programmers have a gender pay gap of about 28%, adjusted. So big. Even after adjusting for everything, it's really big, which kind of resonated with me because I'm kind of like, okay, it's probably like, old school jobs, sort of old school companies that are probably on the trailing end of not willing to make these changes or really look at these things. Mobile engineers, sort of like the newest engineers, it's 2.8%. So it gives me hope. It's getting better. It's changing, sort of the newest people in this field entering, or at least this microcosm, the gap is much smaller. There's some hope. So anyway.
Great, and it's, so we're going to talk about the unconscious bias later, because that's a really important topic that you raised. You also raised the interesting idea that by title there could be different wage gaps. I think that's an important finding for people considering how they might negotiate or enter their job. And Sherry, would you share some of your interesting insights into different ways of thinking about how we should perceive this for our engineering students and our careers?
So I think a lot about engineering students and the engineering workforce, both at the national and international level. And to put engineers in context, there are 1.5 million engineers in the U.S. That's 0.5%. So a lot of people may not even know an engineer growing up. At the same time, there are 3.6 million people who were educated to be engineers, and you might say, oh, we have an oversupply, but the reality is pathways are much more nuanced, that people go into work that's aligned or consistent with their work, but isn't labeled engineers, so we have to be careful of titles. And 1.54 million well, there are like 14% of engineers that don't have an engineering degree. So also, what is the relationship between degrees and the work you do? Of the 1.54 million engineers, 14% are women. So they're very much underrepresented in terms of the engineering workforce. So all of these data will be coming out in the spring in a report by the National Academy of Engineering on the engineering workforce that I've been on the team on. And in that, I've been hanging out a lot with economists. And they have an interesting way of looking at the world, supply and demand. And you know, if somebody wants something and there's not enough supply, you add more money. And so a question I'm really struggling with in terms of engineering is if companies and organizations are really serious about increasing diversity beyond the 14%, where's the money involved in that? So in some ways, the pay gap could actually be flipped as an interesting driver towards diversity if we really are serious about that question.
And one thing that can help drive us to understanding the difference between supply and demand or what's going on in the marketplace is transparency. So the move in Silicon Valley for many companies to report their gender pay data has been, I think, a really important factor in holding us accountable to closing whatever gap we did find. Salesforce was really one of the early companies that came out with this. And what I think is interesting in talking with you is it's not a one and done, it's part of a long journey. And I don't know if you'd be willing to share with us the journey and the work that you're doing.
Well, the journey really started when I went through my own experience and how I personally was elevated into the company. Myself and a fellow colleague, Leila Sika, who's a product executive, we were friends prior to Salesforce, and I had been at Salesforce for 10 years. She had been there at 8 years. And as we kind of came down from that elevation, we wanted to better understand how can we do the same for others in the company, women specifically. How can we bring more women and to the forefront and get them elevated? And then we started talking about pay as one idea. And we just started asking ourselves the question. And in fact, Leila had said to me, well, you run HR, don't you know? And I said, well, we've never done this type of assessment before. So I report to Mark Benioff, our CEO, and I had a one-on-one coming up with him that was very normal cadence, and I brought Leila into that conversation. And we talked specifically about how we can elevate more women at Salesforce, and how can we bring them, you know, into the forefront, into these even key strategic meetings that he has, and how he can better himself know who these women are. And we talked about equal pay as one of these menu of options that we discussed with him. And he said, do we have a problem? And I said, I don't know if we have a problem. But I can tell you, we can't look under the hood, see a big dollar sign, and close the hood. So we're either in or we're not. And he said, we're in, do the assessment. So we did that. And it turns out doing the assessment is kind of, and reporting on the results is kind of the easy part. The hard part is then breaking apart that analysis to really understand where is that gap? Why is there a gap? Is it beginning at the new hire stage? Is it at the promotional stage? And so data plays a really, really key part of this. The dialogue, the questions you start to ask yourself really starts to shift the behavior. And I think Mark, as CEO, coming out and saying this is now a priority for the company, it's part of the DNA of our culture, we're gonna be doing this annually, that alone started to shift behavior in the company. So that's.
And you put your money where your mouth is.
We did.
You closed the gap with the hood.
We did find that 6% of the population was impacted, and we adjusted close to $3 million in salaries.
And at GoDaddy, you also did the analysis, and you had the courage to be authentic and come out reporting before everything was signed, sealed, and delivered. So tell us about your journey.
Yeah, so we made a commitment to publish the data before we knew what the data was. And the assumption was, look, if we publish this data and it's negative, we're going to be exposing not just our problem, but the industry's problem, because we know that we're probably pretty representative. So we spent, frankly, we're doubling down on trying to make sure that we're providing a great environment for women engineers and trying to make sure that the trajectory of those women through their careers is no different than that of a man. And we've done a bunch of work with you guys, which has been super helpful for us. But the key thing was making the commitment upfront to publish. And when we published, I think everybody, it's kind of normal fare now in the Valley to say, well, we have this many women and this many men. Okay, that's terrific. But what you really want to know is, how many women do you have that are in different levels of engineering roles, and what are they being paid? So we actually dissected it down to, an SDE 1, an SDE 2, Software Development Engineer 1, 2, 3, all the way up, to find out what they were making. And we found that it was encouraging results. They were paid, within a percentage of each other, which is terrific. But what we found was that the decay rate of women engineers as they got more senior in their roles started to become pretty apparent. So they start matriculating out of the roles. So there's not just bringing them into the company, but keeping them in company. And this is another thing that we know is Valley-wide, but very few people talk about it. And you start seeing the population dwindle. So we saw that. We know we've got a problem. We have not been able, because we haven't been tracking it long enough, to actually look at promotion trajectory and see if that plays into it, or if it plays into the fact that we're so close in terms of being a percentage point off with men and women engineers in terms of salary, and women actually making just slightly more than men. But we're not completely sure. Taking that information public was really interesting, and the results that I had from other CEOs that contacted me, kind of like, what are you doing? Well, that's not all good news, and we've now done it twice, and it was good movement the second year in some roles, and we actually had some issues with managers being paid less the second year. So as we start getting richer data, we're seeing some things that are good news and some things that are not. And when you're willing to report both good and bad news, it makes it safe. I mean, it is philosophically, if you're willing to report bad news, other people around you are going to feel it's okay too. So doing that, I think, makes it safer for companies that are a hell of a lot larger than ours, because we're only about 5,000 to 6,000 people, to do the same thing. And frankly, the larger the company, the longer it's been around, probably the problem's larger as well.
And part of what I love about your analysis is you have a large call center, so you did the analysis not only on the professional workers, but also the hourly workers.
It goes all the way down to hourly, and actually we just finished doing the Glassdoor, a big Glassdoor study, which was very helpful, validated a lot of our data, all the way down to the call center, and we found on average across the company, the delta in wage on a real dollar basis is around $450 per year per person in the company, which is pretty tight. So we're pretty close. But we know we can do better. And when you see those numbers of matriculation and people falling out and choosing to, pull out of their career for whatever reason because the company's not flexible enough, isn't providing not just, parental leave that's adequate, but what happens when they come back and what's the expectation the manager has of the employee when they come back. All those things, I think, play into it. And we don't have an answer yet. So we've got a lot more work to do on researching and solving small pieces of it.
And as we said, this is not a one-and-done conversation. I think what we're trying to provide here is some insights into all of the ways that we can move forward. And Robert, I know you not only provide analysis and data, but you're also the CEO of a company. And how has that affected your journey as CEO at Glassdoor?
We certainly want to be able to walk this talk. And so the same economists that did this sort of analysis of the Glassdoor data contributed by our users also then turned and looked at our own internal data, much in the same way that these other companies have. We saw about a 20% unadjusted pay gap at Glassdoor. When you adjusted for tenure, job title, et cetera, it disappeared, which we felt good about. That was good. But the true power of this comes from now we have a model. And now we just went through our annual review cycle. We did promotions, we did raises, we did bonuses, and you can just run the whole thing through the model again and say, did we introduce any bias? And I think that's the really powerful thing. And we worked with GoDaddy to basically take this economic model and give it to them. I think we're just going to publish this thing and let companies take it. Because it's the repetition of it, which is the true power of it. Because as you said, sometimes it drifts, sometimes it's a little better, sometimes it's a little worse, but finally you have the ability to know what's going on at a very data-driven level.
And Cindy, you have some really interesting insights when you do the analysis more than one time, that you found some interesting findings around identifying different ways you want to do the analysis with acquisitions and new hires, and would you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, it started to provoke just for my own role, just to ask certain questions. So whether it's when we go through the merit bonus process, through the stock refresh equity process, and you start to ask for different types of analysis, because now you have the data, right? You've done the analysis, you have the data, and then it's about stripping the data and looking at the different aspects, whether it's career progression, whether it's at the recruitment cycle, right? We're looking at different types of data in terms of why are women falling off the interview cycle at a certain time, or why did they decline, for example? Are we seeing any of these types of issues come up, and specific to potentially engineering, which we saw a couple years ago, and sometimes you have to ask yourself, well, why did they drop off? Or why did they go to this other company? And it could be for the mere fact that maybe did you have a woman as part of the interview process? Because that signals a lot to that applicant that speaks to the culture of the company as well. So you can look at it so many different ways, but I think the point is, it's the dialogue that shifts the behavior. It's the questions that shift the behavior. And it started to do that for me in my role. And now as I look at what leaders are doing in terms of rewards and how they're rewarding people in the company, top performers, just across the board, and ensuring that we are doing things in an equitable way. So that alone, the dialogue, the questions you ask, start to shift the behavior.
Thank you. And Sherry, you have some interesting findings on your analysis of both from transition points into engineering and how issues like this affect students.
Yes, I think that it's great to hear discussion of transparency within companies, in working with students and young professionals, the transparency in their whole decision-making, because careers are complex. And it's not necessarily you stay with one company. So I really appreciated your saying, understand why people leave, and are they moving to something that in fact is good for them. It ends up that 60% of people when they graduate with an engineering degree go into engineering. The other 40% are going into non-engineering. And some of that work is very aligned with their degree again, but some of it isn't. And, among men and women who do work that's not aligned, the number one reason is not finding a job, so what's that disconnect that's happening there? Where men and women differ in terms of choosing to do clearly non-engineering work is men are 3 times more likely to say it's because of pay than women. And women are 3 times as likely to say it was job location. So there's some nuanced factors too that even are beyond pay on how people are navigating careers and making choices. So I think having more data is going to give us some insights. I think it also will take data beyond just numbers. I think interviews and understanding more subtle things in deciding what is your career going to be like is going to be important. And as an academic, how do we bring that information to our students? Through websites, through our career development centers, so that they can make better decisions.
And Shelley, it's really important for us to understand, why is it that women and men wind up in these different career paths, and some of this sorting happens? I don't know if you can lend some insight into that.
Yeah, I think Sherry's alluded to some of this as well, but we see, if we think about the sort of pipeline metaphor that's usually used to talk about men and women's entry and persistence, and in the science careers and technology careers more broadly, one thing that we see is that while individuals certainly are making career choices based on their preferences and what they perceive to be their aptitudes, in addition, what research shows us is that gender stereotypes kind of gently nudge men towards some careers and women towards others. And this differentially affects their entry. And in tech, this is especially powerful because we continue to find persistent stereotypes that exist at an implicit or unconscious level, perhaps, where people associate men more with technology than they do women. So to the extent that women are picking up on that message, this could very well affect their persistence along these career paths. And indeed, Sherry, just to build off of your data, we do see that a larger percentage of men men who have degrees in the STEM fields enter into careers in those fields than women do. So we're losing women who've made it through the pipeline at that particular stage. These stereotypes further affect this dropping out behavior that Blake and Cindy were referring to as well. We did a large study with 7 different technology companies, and what we found is that women were more likely than men to say that they were planning to leave the entire field of technology in the next 12 months. Okay, so they've made it through, they're in tech jobs, and they're going to leave. And there again, the biggest predictor of that was their sense that they did not feel like they fit into the environment of technology. They didn't feel like they looked like what a successful tech worker looks like. So I think that's kind of, sounds like a bleak story, but to me it's actually a positive one, because it's really suggesting that there are features of our environment that are chilling women out. And if we can figure out what those features are and alter them, we should be able to retain women. And indeed, I'll just finish with one point here. Social psychological studies show that this is possible, that a simple intervention like changing the images in a computer science classroom at the college level leads women to be more interested in computer science than if the images in the room were sort of more stereotypically masculine. So these are little things that we can do to help not only bring women into tech, but I think keep them there.
And we talked about part of the pay gap being due to undefined factors, and we're really, in some senses, talking about the unconscious bias that might pervade in workplaces. I know, Blake, you've done a lot of work in trying to figure out not just what to do when you do your analysis, but how do you dig into this issue at a much more micro level?
Well, you confront it to start with. And I think you actually start, you try to start at the top. So what we did, which you're intimately familiar with, we actually said, look, we're going to go bring the Clayman Institute into the company, and had 2 Clayman researchers actually attend our most senior calibration meeting to listen to the language of the most senior team who's calibrating the rest of the senior employees, to see how we were talking about women, to actually audit were they being moved up in a 9 box, down in a 9 box, what was the conversation looking like, were you talking more about style than substance, because there's a thing that like women get talked about style, it's not about what they did, and so, I mean, all those types of things. So we started there, and then said we're gonna take this down to the next level, we're gonna audit some of our review metrics, so we're gonna go through actual reviews and have those things audited so people can read them and see what kind of language is in there that might bias a review process. Same thing with promotions, what promotion language does it look like? And then take that information and act on it. Change the language, change the way that you actually describe what good looks like, what bad looks like. Change the language on what promotion language looks like. So you're just actually trying to make it more neutral, because most of these things were written by guys. It's true, right? I mean, that's just because that's where the industry's been. So making those changes, as small and nuanced and subtle as they seem, really have had an impact. And we've even done it in the language where we're describing jobs. Our job description language has changed too, because I've used the phrase code ninja. Well, that's going to attract more dudes than it is women. So you just got to be thoughtful about it. And when you actually bring somebody in to audit your conversation and your language and the way that you write, which stems from the way that you think, if you actually attack those things, and every time you write or you speak, you're processing it through a new lens and a filter, it makes a difference. And so we've seen progress in the company where folks are thinking differently, talking differently. And we've trained managers too. Turns out that when you train somebody in gender bias and how they behave, and if you train them once, they're like, hey, I'm fixed. Woo, solved, which isn't the way it works, right? It's repeated, it becomes part of your culture. You make sure that training happens. It's part of review training. It's part of the way that you treat employees, part of the way you treat your managers, and that becomes part of your company's DNA if you really attack it. So start at the top, get it into the processes, get it into the documentation, get it into the language.
You said something really interesting, is how you write and speak can reflect how you're thinking, and people often wonder, how do you get inside someone's head to see what bias is there? Shelley, you always say really interesting things about how language is a reflection of how we value. Would you lend your insights into how unconscious bias plays a role in how these dynamics play out? I know you,
Yeah, and I want to just echo what Blake said. I mean, there's a lot of interest right now in teaching people about the way that stereotypes introduce bias into evaluations at an unconscious or implicit level. And I think this has been a very important move in the Silicon Valley and in technology to offer this sort of training, because once people learn how stereotypes are affecting their judgments, they generally want to change their behavior. But to Blake's point, that's training, while necessary, is not sufficient. If we want to produce sustainable change, we've got to change the way that we're evaluating people. And this often means diving deep down into understanding how we are evaluating performance. Do we have clear criteria? If we don't have clear criteria, one thing we know from the literature, ambiguity opens the door to bias. So if you're hiring people or promoting people based on your gut feeling about who is more appropriate for the job, that's a situation where stereotypes are likely to affect your decision making. So we've got to get in and not just teach people about how stereotypes work, but to get at the root causes of what amplifies those effects, as you've done at GoDaddy.
and as you said, women or people in the organizations feel the differential effects of this. And Sherry, you have some really interesting ideas about persistence, how that could possibly affect whether the women that you're graduating from degrees in engineering stay in the jobs.
Yeah. And this gets to the issue, too, of granularity. If we lump engineers under one big banner, it's saying there's one engineering culture, and there really are a variety of engineering cultures, because if you look at, on average, 20% of engineering graduates in this day and age are women, and that number rose a little higher and now has actually been declining. But if we tease that apart and look at different fields, electrical and mechanical engineering are at 12%. That compares with civil engineering at 21% and industrial engineering at 30%. And you do see kind of an inverse relationship between those fields and pay. So that's an interesting thing. But there are differences in the cultures even within those areas. So how do we start understanding that is going to be important. I think the correction is one thing to have more neutral language. I'd say that's not going far enough because I actually suspect that women as engineers actually bring additional things to the party. And if the work has always been framed by white men, largely in engineering, it's a set of criteria based on that. And I think there's really a possibility to say, could engineers do other things too? Or, how they treat one another or even frame, the questions could be a really potential win on multiple levels, not only from persistence, but what's the work itself.
Mm-hmm. And you made a really interesting point earlier that in some engineering career paths, it's good to have a cross-functional approach to developing your career. In other engineering paths, it could be a disadvantage in being seen as a technical expert.
Yeah, it is interesting looking at organization. So what does a career advancement path look like? And, if you've got a company that's highly technical, maybe there's one path where you actually dig deeper into the technical and advance. But maybe in terms of pay raises, it's better to actually get into project management. And that's the way that you rise in the organization in terms of influence and rewards. Mm-hmm. So I think it's industry specific too.
And it goes back to your question, is how do you help young engineers figure out these nuances and differences so they can plan their career successfully, which often brings us to the question of negotiation. So let's say you are in a job and you're facing what you might imagine could be or could not be a pay gap. What do you do? How do you think about it? And Robert, would you share some ideas about how Glassdoor has thought about helping women and individuals find the tools they need to negotiate?
Yeah, data solves this, or it's a necessary precursor to being able to solve it. So pay gap or not, if you don't know how much is typically paid for a role that you're interviewing for, you're probably in a poor negotiating position. Let's just say, no matter man, woman, experienced or not, if you don't have the data, you probably are ill-prepared. And that's what we set out to solve with Glassdoor. We feel like people are making huge decisions about where to go to work, about, when to say, that looks like a good deal to me, I'm gonna say yes. And they're doing it with before Glassdoor, very little information. So the idea was, get people to tell us their salaries, pull it all together, and make it available back to the public for free. We just recently launched a product called Know Your Worth, which we have so much salary data now that we actually can predict, given a person and their education history and where they work now and their job title and their experience, we can predict what we think they should be earning. In their local marketplace. It's very specific, which independent of race or gender. And again, this is going one step further. Before we Glassdoor provided, okay, this is what software engineers at Google make, or this is what software engineers in the Valley make, and you could do this. This is different. This is what I, Robert Homan, or you, Lori, we think you should make. And it's incredibly powerful to begin a negotiation with that kind of data at your back.
And I love the idea that this is not only good for employees, but for employers who want to retain the very best talent in their organizations. And Cindy, I know Salesforce has also done a lot of work to help not only require people to negotiate for themselves, but to think creatively about creating a level playing field so that people don't have to always be their only advocate.
Yes, and I think, for me, I think personally, as a female leader, I go back to this phrase of, well, how do we get women to be more confident to negotiate? But I don't believe this is a woman's problem, and that's my personal viewpoint. There are two sides, right? There are two people in the conversation. If you're coming into a company, you've got a recruiter asking questions. How often does a recruiter say, well, what is your current compensation today? And then they base everything from there. It's about shifting that dialogue to say instead, well, what compensation do you expect? Or for the other party to say, well, how does this offer compare to my peer level in the company? And I think, honestly, as companies like GoDaddy and others become more transparent about their pay practices, it almost will hopefully eliminate this negotiation issue that seems to be a big obstacle. But I don't feel it's about necessarily making women more confident to ask. That said, it did force me to look back on my own career and figure out, did I ask those questions? How often does a manager give you a merit increase and say, congratulations, here's your merit increase, and then that's the end of the conversation? And so I think again, it's changing the language. I think we've heard that phrase. It's really, really important. When Mark Benioff came out, like I said, on equal pay and elevating women and requiring 30% women to be part of his key strategic meetings, that was one thing. But it was also, because I was part of that, and I elevated in my career because of it, but it was also my responsibility to stay in those meetings. So everyone has a responsibility, right? And so while I think we have done a lot to train managers and train also women in the company who have expressed this about negotiating more and how can they do it, and if they do it once and get turned down, how do they go back at it again, right? Because that's the other aspect of it. But this is not perfect by any means, but I'm hoping that in years' time, because of the transparency that hopefully companies will come to the forefront and acknowledge their pay practices, that this negotiation piece will kind of settle.
Right, and then at the Clayman Institute, we agree with you that resiliency and grit is one of a person's best friend when you're navigating these difficult career paths. And as you said, it's not that you did it once and it was successful and you keep moving forward. There are going to be ups and downs. And I think one of the things I found the most valuable for me was not only the resilience and grit I developed, but finding like-minded people in the company who would shore each other up in order to move forward through whatever challenges there are, business, personal, whatever. And Shelley, would you illuminate for us? I think you made a really good point. Negotiation is not always the woman's responsibility.
Yes, and I want to talk about that, but I want to share one example first that comes that really underlines what Robert was talking about. I had a student email me 2 days ago who had been in my sociology of gender class where I teach negotiation, and she told me that she had gotten the sense that she was being underpaid in her job, and so she was nervous, but she was going to go ask her employer to raise her salary by $5,000. But then she turned to Glassdoor, a few other sites to try to figure out what the going rate was for her job, which there was no way in the past she would have been able to find that. And she found out to her surprise that she shouldn't be asking for $5,000, but $20,000. And so said she was even more nervous, but she took what she'd learned about negotiation. She went in with the case to her manager, showing the data, and her manager immediately raised her salary by $20,000. Awesome. So, I like to say I'm glad the class paid off, but it's also, having that kind of data is extremely powerful, and that level of transparency, I think, is going to help a lot with the gender differences in negotiation that we've seen in the past that have led to gender differences in the pay that men and women earn. But the other piece of this, and Cindy, I think, alluded to, is we've got to do more than just encourage women to negotiate. We've got to create environments within our companies that allow women to negotiate without penalty. And there's numerous studies out that show that when women negotiate for higher salaries, they usually get the higher salaries, but there's a pushback, and that the person they negotiated with will not want to work with them, okay? Negotiating hard violates our expectation that women are not supposed to be aggressive and self-promoting. So we've got to change that environment. And even a recent study I was reading shows that even the most, I think, justifiable reason to negotiate for a higher pay, someone made you an outside offer and they're willing to pay you more. I mean, if that happens to you, that should be the easiest time to go to your supervisor and share that. When women do that, when they come in with an outside offer, one of the pushbacks they get is they're not loyal to the company and sort of penalized for not being loyal. So we've got to create the space within our workplaces where if we're going to have negotiation, we allow it for both men and women. And doing so because if we want to retain women, we're going to have to keep their pay equal to men. If they find out they're not being paid at the same rate, they're going to walk out, vote with their feet. And so this is a retaining women issue as well.
So I've been at the Claimant Institute for 9 years. Londa Schiebinger brought me in, and I remember when I was hired, they said, "Why are you getting an MBA to run a gender research institute?" And the answer was, well, feminism could use a little marketing. But one of the things that I always push for in our organization is, how is this going to create change? So here we are sitting on top of really brilliant ideas, great thinking, but unless our ideas promote the greater good, we're not doing our full job. So one of the things I want to leave us with today is not just what we can do as individuals, not just what we can do as individuals inside of an organization, but what sort of collective action could be motivated by this discussion today that could help the industry move forward? Because we've had a lot of discussion about how one company's actions can affect another. If you bring pay inequality into your negotiation, you could accidentally keep replicating that throughout a person's career. So what are the ideas we have here at the table? I'm going to ask each of you to share one idea that we could take away from today's discussion about collective action that could help the high-tech industry be more inclusive and to diminish the pay equity gap. Sherry, I'd like to start with you.
Well, I would offer thinking about what are new and enhanced partnerships between industry and the academy. We're talking about individuals making decisions, and one day they're a student and the next day they're a professional. And so how do we work together on helping those individuals make good, informed decisions? And that could be through new models of career development centers on campuses. It can be through classes like Shelley's that are giving key skills that are useful even beyond employment, probably with spouses too, in negotiating. I've started a class with partners called Designing the Professional and Designing Your Life, where students are intentionally thinking about what are their values and what is their path. So how can we think differently about moving beyond a transaction model of student becoming professional to a partnership?
Great. And I love what you said about it's a richer approach to careers than just the transactions. So I think that really resonates with the young people I've met who want to know that not only is their work being valued monetarily, but being valued for the mission that they're going forward to. So this approach feels like it's not only good for students, but good for what technology will do in the future. Blake, would you be willing to share your idea for collective action? What can move the high-tech industry forward?
Yeah. So,
Small question.
small question. I'm going, man, it's a big one. I think when you are hiring, and we have this phrase that we call pay it backward, which you have two identical jobs. You hire a man into one, you hire a woman into the other, and you base it on that increase in salary, that you don't just look at the increase in salary, you look at the entry of both of those roles and make sure that you're treating them the same. And we had an instance at the company where we had somebody hire in at a pretty senior level, a man, hired in, great work experience, big history, and gave him an offer. Here was the number, here's your equity, here's the bonus structure. A woman, 2 weeks later, same job, exact same job, different team, came in, gave her the same increase, ready to pull the trigger on it, looked at, I actually asked the head of HR, are we doing this ourselves? Are we actually perpetuating the problem? Let's go look at the offer and see where the two salaries end up landing. Guess what? The woman candidate was bringing her salary disparity and the problem that the industry has had over the last decades with her. And even though the numbers were identical, she was being paid less. So we said, amend her offer. Make sure it's exactly the same, because we're not going to perpetuate this anymore. We're just going to bring them in at the exact same number and just get on with it. But this is happening industry-wide. So when you're hiring somebody from another, don't just look at the numbers and what the increase is. Look and see what identical roles are, and even at the senior level, and make sure that folks are being paid the same. I think I would ask every company in the Valley to do that.
And you're talking about industry norms.
Yes.
There's no reason why salaries are based on what you made before. That's just a norm that's been perpetuated over time, which brings the inequality of one place to the next place. So if we as an industry would agree to stop that practice and instead look at what people are worth at a certain level and make sure everyone was paid at that level, we would eliminate the need for individuals to have to negotiate through that and justify what their new salary would be.
Right.
Great. Cindy, would you share your idea for collective action?
Well, I've talked about this before, and I think it's really important across no matter what industry you're in, but the role of the CEO is very impactful. It is critical. They set the vision, they define the priorities of the company. They are the ones that are able to shift behavior, and I think that is just very, very critical. Our CEO, Mark Benioff, has a business plan every year called the V2 MOM, and it stands for Vision, Values, Methods, Obstacles, and Measures. Vision is kind of what we aspire to do. The values are the values that are going to achieve that vision. The methods are the actions that we're going to take, and the obstacles are the hurdles that we have to overcome. And the measures track success for us, right? And this, a couple of years ago when we did the assessment, that is when we started to shift. And every employee has a V2 MOM, and it does start with Mark's V2 MOM at the company level. But for the first time, we started to put measures that would track progress with women in leadership roles, women being promoted. And I think that alone starts to shift because the CEO is saying, we are going to change the mindset in this company. We are going to now make this a priority. And I think that also speaks to one other thing that's been very important in my own career. Sometimes I have a lot of women that come to me and say, I need to find a women mentor, I need to find someone, a female that can help me. And I always ask the question, well, why does it have to be a woman? Because males are in the position of power right now. That is the reality. And if I look back on my own career, every advocate and champion and my mentor today, for the most part, have been all male. And so then you have to turn around and ask these males in these top leadership roles, who are you advocating for? Who are you championing? What are you doing to improve, right? the company, the culture, the state of the world, because that's ultimately what we want to achieve. And at the end of the day, it's just doing the right thing.
And I think these forums enable CEOs, leaders of companies, to work through the issues it takes to have the courage to take the first action and move forward.
And it's not easy. I mean, I think, I think it's sometimes a little bit, some CEOs, for example, in equal pay might be a little bit fearful of having the conversation because you don't know what's under the hood, right? And so it's a delicate conversation, but I'm happy that it's gained momentum, and I hope that we continue to have these conversations and that we continue to see the progress being made.
Robert, please share your ideas for collective action.
I have twofold. I'm sitting here forming a few. So for sure, we should, I feel like executives and leaders should just, we've got the data now. The analysis is pretty well understood. Just need to do the analysis, and then we need to stop talking about it and actually just take action. We've talked a lot about this, and I think more companies just need to do it. And so I would like to see, companies follow Salesforce and GoDaddy's like amazing example on this, and just do it. Pull the trigger. And from an executive standpoint, I think everything we've talked about today, and from a leadership standpoint, is incredibly important. And we should continue to push on this and get better. But there's something I'm picking up on today too, which is I just want to say, women have tremendous power too, and especially young women entering the technology field in particular. I haven't met a CEO who would not die to have like the best engineers, period. Like, we're starving for data scientists and engineers, and it doesn't matter what color they are or what gender they are. Like, we're just starving. And when the data's there so that use your power. Use your power and demand to get paid. Do what this young lady did. And basically, when you find out you're underpaid by $20K, like, they're going to pay you because they want to keep you if you're good. And there's no reason. So use your power is what is probably the thing that I would say too. So there's collective action on both sides. And I think there is enough transparency and data, and we'll keep pushing on that part, but use it. Use it.
And I want to say, I'm going to make a little mini commercial. On the Clayman Institute website, gender.stanford.edu, there's a video on negotiation that helps individuals, men and women, frame the conversation so that we approach these important negotiations, use our power in ways that will actually produce the results I want. It's done by Maggie Neal from the Graduate School of Business. And one of the things she talks about is to make sure if we frame our negotiation in a communal way, for the good of the technology, for the vision we're bringing, for what we want to create for the team, backed by data, women are more likely to get their negotiations well received. So I agree with you. Use your power and find the tools that will make you more effective, like this negotiation video. Shelley, would you share your ideas on collective action?
Yeah, I've really been so impressed with all the good things that are happening in the industry to try to increase the representation of women in tech. And as someone who's done research in this area, I think we know a lot about the kinds of things that would help. And as we a few years ago, when we launched the Center for the Advancement of Women's Leadership, I was thinking about, what's really keeping us stuck? I mean, all these people in the industry are really working hard, wanting to make change. We have a lot of good social science about what's blocking women's advancement. And to me, the thing that really became clear is that I think we need to bridge the gap between academia and industry more effectively so that we can mutually be learning from each other. So I'm a big fan at this point and think we need more of research around what would create better environments for women that takes place actually in companies, working with people in those companies to design interventions and test them there. That's the kind of data I think that really allows us to create solutions that not only work in theory, theory, but also work in practice. So I think that's my biggest, I guess, idea. And the other thing I just want to push us forward as we continue to think about this conversation is that we also need to be attending to the intersections of gender with race. When it comes to the wage gap, for example, we know it's wider for Black women and for Latino women and smaller for Asian women. Why is that? What can we do to take action around that? And further, we need to be looking at this across the pay scale, which I think the Glassdoor data is allowing us to do. But if we were able to also really key in on gender wage gaps at the bottom of the pay distribution, that would be important, because if we could close that wage gap, we could do a lot towards eliminating poverty in this country. And I think that would be another big payoff to this kind of data, and learning to understand this kind of data and acting on it.
It's really important to remember when we talk about the high-tech industry, we're talking about engineers and professional workers, but we're also talking now about people who drive buses or serve food in cafeterias. So what is how can we use our power for the good of eliminating poverty, even within our companies, when mostly who we think we see in those organizations are the people who are earning high levels of salaries like each other. So I think that's a really brilliant point to keep reminding us that we're in a diverse ecosystem, and our jobs touch everybody, not only from the technologies that are being developed, but from the people who are doing all kinds of work in our organization. Great.